In May 2008, 19-year-old college student Brandon Swanson was coming back from a party when his car swerved off a gravel road in Minnesota. Stranded, he called his parents for help, and even with describing the location to them, they just couldn't find him no matter how hard they tried. An hour into the call, his parents experienced what was likely the boy's final words, because afterwards, the line went completely silent. His abandoned car was found the next day, but Brandon was never seen again. This is the case of Brandon Swanson. Hi, I'm Oricat and welcome to our channel. I deliver cases to you in the dramatisation format, so if that's something you enjoy, you'll be happy to know we upload once a week. As always, my aim is to give a voice to the victims and remember them as they were. So with that, let us begin. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on the 30th of January 1989 in Marshall, Minnesota. He was born to Annette and Brian Swanson and had a younger sister called Jasmine. Brandon stood at 5'6" with brown hair and blue eyes. His right ear was pierced and he wore correctional glasses. Now Brandon was known to be a very intelligent and funny guy. He was well liked, he had lots of friends and was very close to his family. One of his favourite things to do was reading, which translated into him really excelling at school. Though Brandon was actually legally blind in one eye, this was brought on from an injury in childhood. The condition caused him to have lack of depth perception. This basically meant the inability to perceive distance between two objects. And this did have an impact on his life, especially if he didn't have his glasses on him, which is why it was such an achievement for him to have done so well at school. Because without wearing his glasses, struggling with depth perception can lead to not being able to tell the difference between the road and the sidewalk, not seeing how far or close a car is to your vehicle, or increasing the chances of tripping and falling. After graduating from Marshall High School in 2007, Brandon chose to study wind turbines for a year at the Minnesota West Community and Technical College. In the fall, he was intending to transfer to Iowa Western Community College in Council Bluffs, Iowa, to major in science. On the 13th of May 2008, classes at Minnesota West ended for the year. Students were staying in the local town of Canby to celebrate with friends and basically have a night of drinking and partying. 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was no exception to this. Home to around 2,000 people, Canby was quite out in the sticks. It was very agricultural and nature-orientated and had a very tight-knit community. Naturally, a popular boy, Brandon attended 2 parties over the course of the night with his friends. He dressed comfortable, not particularly suitable for the cold weather, but in fairness he was coming and going from different houses. Brandon wore a blue striped polo shirt, a black hooded sweatshirt, blue jeans, a silver chain, and a white baseball cap. Now Brandon did indulge in some drinking at these 2 parties, but really that's what you'd expect teenagers to do. His friends at the party said that Brandon had a cup or 2, but he definitely did not have enough to make him act or seem intoxicated. Anyway, Brandon left these parties a fair bit after midnight and settled on travelling back home in the early morning hours. He was intending to get back home to Marshall from Canby, which was around a 30-mile trip, and it would take him approximately half an hour. Now from Canby to Marshall, it was a really straightforward route. If you just followed Highway 68, you would get there. So Brandon went on his way and was feeling pleasantly buzzed from the alcohol, but obviously he wasn't crashing the car, so he thought he was alright to drive. I don't think Brandon thought that the police would see it the same way though. Despite his better judgment, at some point on Highway 68, Brandon peeled off and started driving on some of the backcountry roads. Sure, this would lengthen his journey a bit more, but he would eventually rejoin on Highway 68. It was just enough time for him to potentially dodge any police. You see, by the students, it was theorised that the police were likely waiting about to see if they could catch college students coming back from parties, and Brandon didn't want to be one of those students. Now, the country roads were very dark, like they only would have been navigatable if you had your headlights on in the first place. And Brandon was feeling fuzzy-headed, and obviously an animal could have jumped out at any time. Not only this, but the roads were narrow and the turns were tight. So when he was driving, Brandon would really have to have his wits about him. But unfortunately, when he reached the 3900 block of Lion Lincoln Road, he lost control of the vehicle. Perhaps he was just tired or slow to react, but his Chevrolet Lumina swerved and got stuck in a ditch. Now, the car didn't take much damage, and apparently neither did Brandon. Initially stunned, this sudden impact kind of knocked Brandon out of the drunken haze he had been in. But still, he had enough awareness to see that his car was well and truly stuck. He tried backing up the vehicle and shifting it, but it was just fixed in this impossible position, facing the farmlands rather than any proper direction on the road. Frustrated, Brandon got out of his car to take in his surroundings, and at least his headlights were still working, so that gave him a decent amount of light. So, hands on his head, he looked around and he realised he was really not in the greatest position. He was completely stuck in rural Minnesota, yet he was still pretty confident that he knew the exact location he was stranded in. He'd done this drive many times and said to himself with certainty that he had been on the road to a town called Lind, which meant he didn't have to panic too much because he had a friend that lived there if worst came to worst. So Brandon first began calling all his friends, hoping to see if anyone could rescue him out of this embarrassing situation. But he was getting no response, which left Brandon with his last resort. So, cap in hand, Brandon sheepishly phoned his parents. And let it be known that after a night of partying, it would be natural for his parents to presume that he had drank too much. Brandon was likely worried he would get some type of telling off, because some might say that this might have been a teenager's worst nightmare, which was getting the dreaded "I told you so." Now, Brandon called up his parents just before 2 a.m, and his dad was the one who originally picked up the phone. And they basically said to him, "Brandon, why are you calling so late?" Before he had called, they had been kind of worried, because yes, they were expecting him to come from college back home, but at the same time, with how late it had gotten, they did think it was feasible that he might have stayed over with a friend. But no, Brandon had to awkwardly explain that he was coming back from a party and then his car got stranded on the side of the road. He asked if they could come and pick him up, and without hesitation, his parents got into their car and started driving. They kept on the phone with Brandon and started asking him for further directions, and Brandon was happy to reply to them that he was definitely near Lind. Well acquainted with the routes out of Marshall, Brandon's parents presumed this to mean that Brandon was somewhere along Highway 23, because that was the highway that went straight through Lind. And his parents were really worried about him, and they wanted to find him as quick as possible, because it was a really cold night that night. I mean, the lowest temperatures were dropping to around 4 degrees. As they travelled, the phone did keep losing connection, but it was good enough to be able to let Brandon guide them to his location. So after Brandon had completely described to the best of his ability where his car was actually stuck, his parents stopped along Highway 23. They sat in the car and began flashing their headlights on and off, and just said to Brandon, "Can you see us flashing our lights?" Brandon said no, he couldn't see them, but he told them that he was going to get into his own car and try the same thing. So like his parents, Brandon flashed his headlights, asking them if they could see him, and his parents responded no, they couldn't. This led his parents to conclude that they couldn't possibly be anywhere near Brandon. So naturally, they implied to Brandon that he was the one getting the directions wrong, and that they couldn't help him and they couldn't find him if he didn't tell them exactly where he was. You know, he'd done the drive so many times, so he should have been keeping an eye on where he was. You know, unless he was too drunk to do so. And Brandon adamantly said that he wasn't intoxicated, he hadn't hit his head, he was absolutely fine. And his parents didn't think he sounded particularly slurred on the phone. But tempers did start running high. Brandon was absolutely freezing and he just wanted them to hurry up and find him. Whereas his parents were just like, they cannot do that unless Brandon gives them the exact location. At one point, the conversation got so fractious that Brandon's mother did hang up the phone. But this was only for a brief moment of exasperation, because she called up immediately after and apologised for losing her temper. But still, Brandon was irritated over them questioning his sense of direction and just generally frustrated at the situation he was in. Brandon told them he was going to start walking himself. He was convinced he could see lights in the distance, which he thought had to be the town of Lind. So he told his parents that he could make it there on foot and that a friend lived there. His parents were unkeen with him doing this, but they supposed that as long as he was still on the phone with them, it was better than them just not knowing where he was. It would be safe to say at this point, Brandon wasn't well suited to be making this type of trek. It was 4 degrees and he was dressed reasonably light. Not to mention, he didn't take his glasses with him. And as I said earlier, that would really decrease his navigational skills and increase his chances of tripping and hurting himself. Later on, no one would really understand why Brandon didn't take his glasses with him that night. Though perhaps he was more disorientated from the car crash than he said he was. Anyway, so Brandon started walking, and as he did so, he kept on the phone with his parents and he kept narrating every single thing he came across. You know, whether he went down a hill or up a hill or whether he had to climb a fence. And at some point, because Brandon was still talking to his parents, he just decided that perhaps they should be the ones to pick him up, because he was cold and after everything he had been through, he didn't really fancy staying with a friend. So he told his parents to drive up to the parking lot of a bar in the local area of Lind. So Brandon's parents did this because they didn't have a better alternative. They travelled as slow as they could, all the while keeping the line of contact open with Brandon. They kind of hoped that they would arrive there at the same time as him. 30 minutes went past, and Brandon had climbed over his first big fence. He told his parents as much. Then another 15 minutes went by, and he had to clear yet another fence, but this time he said that he could hear a river flowing nearby. Having been on the phone with his parents for a whole 47 minutes, just after 2:30 a.m, Brandon climbed his final fence, quoted to say, "Not another fence." And as usual, he continued narrating, but one moment he was completely conversational, and in the next, it was like he had been cut off. His parents thought they heard the sound of a foot slipping, and the final thing Brandon exclaimed on the phone was, "Oh shit," before he went silent. And for a while, his parents were just craning over the phone, likely the only sound their own heartbeats. They were just waiting for Brandon to say something else, but he never did. Because his exclamation hadn't sounded like he was experiencing crippling fear. Instead, it sounded like he was alarmed or surprised. Panic overtaking them, Brandon's parents began shouting his name over and over again into the phone, but there was no response. They thought that perhaps Brandon had dropped his phone and was struggling to find it again in the dark. So they ended the call and rung his number again, in the hopes that when they did so, his phone screen would light up and that would alert him to where he had dropped his phone. But Their attempts kept going to voicemail and they just couldn't get in touch with him. And right now, Annette and Brian were basically living every parent's worst fear. To be talking to your child like that, and him seemingly being okay, just for it to all end in an instant. And all sorts of thoughts were going through their mind. Did they really just hear their son's final words? Or was there a chance they could still find him? So Brandon's parents spent the rest of the early morning hours driving up and down Highway 23, including all the back and country roads, just for any sign of their son. And then at 6:30 a.m, they reported him missing to the police. Initially, the police told Brandon's parents to wait, suggesting that Brandon was in the age range of someone who might be likely to disappear for a few days, considering that all the classes had ended. And the police officer they actually spoke to at the time was largely unsympathetic and kind of treated them like they were being overbearing. He shrugged and told them that they should be aware that Brandon has every right to be missing if he wants to be missing. Later that morning, the Lind police did start a search around the town, but there was no trace of Brandon there or in the surrounding area. Therefore, they requested that the Lyon County Sheriff, Joe Dahl, assist them to speed up their work efforts. To better focus the search, Dahl authorised looking through Brandon's phone to kind of get a more accurate reading of his final location. But to the police's utter bafflement, when they looked into where his phone had actually pinged, it was registering that Brandon was near Taunton, not Lind. He was around 25 miles away from where he thought he was. He was calling along Highway 68, the main route from Canby to Marshall. So the police presumed that he must have gotten confused and thought that he was travelling on Highway 23, which was from Lind to Marshall. So no wonder his parents couldn't find him. They had been searching all along 23 whilst Brandon was stuck on 68. But those involved in the case just couldn't understand why Brandon had been so confused over his location, unless he was more drunk and disorientated than he was letting on. Because he had driven that route so many times, but during those early morning hours, of his own volition, he had chosen to peel off and go through all the back roads. Consequently, all this information led to the discovery of his car around the Taunton area. The car was found stuck in a ditch off a gravel road. There was no way to indicate what direction the car had been travelling in when it crashed, not to mention the car doors were left wide open. At this point, Brandon Swanson was officially declared as having gone missing on the 14th of May 2008 near Porter, Minnesota. Technically, the location of the car was found along the Lincoln County line, so that county sheriff, Jack Vazecki, was brought into the investigation as well. He eventually informed the public that the car had got hung on an incline at the edge of the road. Not serious enough to damage the car, but enough to keep the wheels from touching the ground on that side. He also stated that there was nothing amiss around the car to suggest the struggle had taken place, but there weren't any tracks either to suggest what direction Brandon had started walking in. By May 15th, Brandon's phone call with his parents was officially narrowed down to coming from within 5 miles of the cell phone tower in Taunton, so searchers were focusing their efforts there. Part of the search circle included Yellow Medicine County to the north, so authorities from that jurisdiction also took part. Dahl himself noted that when they were searching the area in the evening hours, he said that when he was walking about, he could see a red light in the distance. Upon investigation, he said that this red light was on top of a Taunton grain elevator. Informed on the phone call that Brandon had had with his parents, Dahl proposed that it was possible that when Brandon was walking about, he saw the red light too, which led him to believe that he was near the town of Lind, and consequently convinced Brandon that it was within walking distance. Extensive searches of the area continued, using search dogs and aerial support, and this was particularly concentrated around the Yellow Medicine River. A team of bloodhounds managed to pick up a 3-mile scent trail of Brandon that largely followed all the field roads to an abandoned farm situated northwest from his car. At that point, it seemed like the scent entered the river. It then came out, went all the way past the river, and stopped abruptly on the Yellow Medicine County line, like Brandon had been plucked out of thin air. At this point, the state's original theory was that Brandon had been intoxicated, and that he had either drowned in the river, died of hypothermia, or fell into a cistern. A cistern was a large waterproof container that stored liquids for domestic use and consumption. Boats from the state's Department of Natural Resources were deployed along the river and gates were installed. During the time Brandon had gone missing, it was reported that some parts of the river had even gone as far as being 10 feet deep, but these water levels had gone down a lot by the time the search efforts were conducted. Deputies scoured so much of the riverbank, on horseback and foot, yet there was absolutely no trace of Brandon, bar his scent. After the original search for Brandon concluded, especially after they couldn't find his actual phone and his car keys, Dahl discontinued organised group searches. But this didn't stop Sheriff Vasecki, the one they brought in late from the county over. Despite the proper searches stopping, Vasecki continued to walk the riverbank for 2 miles every day for the next month after Brandon's disappearance. He truly believed that Brandon was a victim of homicide and that it had been a crime of opportunity. But regardless, Vasecki really wanted to find him and have something to bring back to his family. Searches did resume in full after the crops that had been planted during the time Brandon had gone missing were harvested. During this time, the dogs picked up another scent, which led them to a piece of farming equipment on private farming property. Though like the other farmers, the owner of the equipment didn't allow the police to have a proper search of his property. Then later, the dogs picked up another scent, but this time it wasn't specifically Brandon's, but it was human remains. This led the searchers onto an area northwest of Porter, which hadn't been explored before. This place was a marshy environment situated around Mud Creek. Mud Creek was a tributary of the Yellow Medicine River. Search efforts would pause in the winter and then pick up in spring, after the snow had melted, but before the crops had been planted. And this was a search cycle that continued through to 2011. By that time, 122 square miles had been searched, and the case was now in the hands of the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. They set up a tip line, and by 2015, almost 90 leads had been reported. These leads linked up with the theory that there were human remains in the Mud Creek area. As of 2021, the authorities updated the public and told them that they were still persisting with searches around the surrounding farmland. They don't dispute the farmers' decisions to not let them search their properties, but they are trying to come to a compromise, which means they can search without affecting the farmers' crop seasons too much. Unfortunately, search efforts are slow regardless due to the use of search dogs, which are imperative for cases taking place over flat rural land. Minnesota in particular treats search dogs as a very precious resource. In fact, during the state's whole history, there's never been more than 3 search dogs granted for a case or search like this. So those 3 allocated dogs have a really big area they still have to cover. As of 2023, it's stated that tips are still incoming. And interestingly, they've received more information pertaining to the circumstances that occurred before Brandon went missing. This includes a third-hand claim that Brandon got into an argument with someone at one of the parties he attended. As always, towards the end of my cold case videos, we discuss theories, and I'm going to go on to talk about the 4 most pertinent ones to this case. The first theory is that Brandon accidentally drowned in the river. I mean, in conversation, he did say that he was near the river, and the phone call ended abruptly, which means whatever happened had to have happened really suddenly. I mean, his vision was impaired and he didn't have glasses, so he might not have been able to see if something like that was in front of him, and he may have stepped into the river by accident. Not to mention, because the water levels were higher than normal, it was definitely going to be a hazard to someone who was either drunk or disorientated. Though his parents don't agree with this at all due to the search results. Yes, the dogs did follow a scent into the river, but then they followed the scent past it. So this suggested that even if Brandon had gone into the river, he climbed back out again and continued walking. As his parents said, he was of sound mind, and if he had been involved in some type of accident involving water, then why didn't the phone cut off and break? Why did it take the parents having to hang up to end the call? The second theory, and the most unlikely one in my opinion, is voluntary disappearance. He technically was at an age where he could do something independent like that and probably get away with it, but his parents resolutely believed that he was happy. And considering he was trying to get into contact with so many people before he phoned up his parents, suggested that he really did want to be found. Plus, again, he was lucid on the phone, so it can't have been like there was a mental break taking place. The third theory is foul play, which Sheriff Vasecki is most passionate for, even though there is no proper evidence to back this up. The sheriff says that it was opportunistic, someone was likely lurking in the shadows. Plus, Brandon did pass an abandoned farm. Was there some type of transient or vagrant there that took a chance when he walked past? I mean, his phone was never found, and part of Brandon's law acknowledges cases involving abduction. Then there's also the potential, if foul play was involved, did he know the person? The third-hand witness statement says that he got into an argument with someone that night before he left to go back home. Did they potentially follow him and run him off the road? Truthfully though, there were no extra car tracks to suggest that there was another vehicle nearby. And obviously, if he felt he was being followed, then I think it's a guarantee he would have sounded more distressed to his parents on the phone. And then as for meeting someone by chance, which may have led to a sinister outcome, then why did Brandon only say, "Oh shit"? You would have thought if he was being attacked by someone, there would be a much louder commotion going on. And remember, his parents didn't hear anything other than silence. They didn't hear him in pain, and they didn't hear anything like a gunshot. The final theory, which I personally think is the most likely, is that he succumbed to the elements or came across an unforeseen hazard. The fact that he left without his glasses suggests to me that he wasn't exactly as lucid as he was putting forth for his parents. He might have been drunk, but with the combination of the crash and then getting out of the car and then walking about in all that freezing cold weather, it might have sobered him up enough to talk to them properly. Plus, when the car did get stuck in a ditch, you would presume that when that happened, Brandon would have lurched forward. I think there was probably a high chance he likely hit his head on the steering wheel. And yes, straight afterwards he might have thought he was fine, but he was clearly groggy enough to mix up Highway 68 and Highway 23. Plus, during his travels, if he had waded into the river and then got out again and continued walking, there's just no way he would be able to survive in wet clothes and 4 degrees without succumbing to hypothermia. Then there's the opinion that he could have fallen down an unmarked well. But my only problem with this particular hazard being the cause of his disappearance was that his phone was still on, even when Brandon stopped talking. If he was hurt in some way, or he did fall down somewhere, wouldn't the phone have either picked up his groans or broken upon contact with the ground? Though it's also worth noting that it was very uncommon for abandoned wells to be unmarked on such flat farmland. And at some point during the time of Brandon's disappearance, Minnesota had already started the process of capping unmarked wells. Perhaps whether it was due to hypothermia or dizziness, perhaps Brandon fell unconscious in the middle of one of the farming fields. Sometimes people can feel it moments before they're due to pass out, and perhaps for Brandon that moment was when he exclaimed, "Oh shit." Though this would be hard to prove since the farmers aren't allowing searches on their property. Which is understandable because a police search would mean all their fields being dug up, and this would have a massive knock-on effect on their livelihood. And we have to bear in mind that dogs did find Brandon's scent on farming equipment. So was it possible that Brandon was rendered unconscious or possibly deceased and farming equipment ran over him? Perhaps a farmer didn't want to get in trouble with the police and didn't want to be done for manslaughter charges. Since Brandon has gone missing, the Swansons have kept their porch light on all night every night, as a symbol of their hope that Brandon will be eventually found and returned to them. They still do that to this very day. The aftermath of his disappearance led to his mother Annette campaigning for Brandon's law to be introduced into Minnesota. It was signed in 2009 by Governor Jim Pauley. This mandates immediate police investigation for missing adults in potentially dangerous situations. The law advocates for preventing future delays in cases. Brandon's law has inspired similar legislation in 4 other states, emphasising the importance of acting quickly on a missing persons case and not treating it a certain way just because of initial assumptions. Unfortunately, Brandon's case is one that is just as haunting in 2024 as it was in 2008. But we can only hope that one day his family get the answers they deserve. Because I think losing him on the phone just like that has to be one of the worst possible experiences. Just so heartbreaking for his parents. If anyone has any more information on Brandon, the number to call is 507 694 1664. Thank you for watching. Comment yes or no down below whether you think foul play was involved.